Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Welcome to this Friday's lecture with Dr. Carlos Schmidt-Padilla. This event is organized by the Berkeley-Stanford Latin American Politics Workshop, which is a group that we have formed with some of our colleagues on the two sides of the bay in Stanford and Berkeley. And I really want to thank Alison Post and Thad Donning, who have been really big, enthusiastic supporters of this initiative. We initially wanted to kickstart this workshop in person. Unfortunately, we are still on this online format, and I'm just so much looking forward to having these interactions resume in person. Before I get started, I do want to also say that this event is co-sponsored with the UC Berkeley Center for Latin American Studies and the Stanford Center for Latin American Studies. It will be streamed on our Stanford YouTube live stream. Please, do keep in mind that you will be able to watch this again even after the live stream ends, and we will have closed captioning options available. And please kindly submit any questions you have, those of you who are in Zoom or those who are in YouTube, into the chat so that I can then convey your questions to Dr. Schmidt-Padilla. I do want to remind everyone that here at Stanford, we are in the land and territory of the Ohlone original peoples. Berkeley happens to be sits on the territory of the Huichin, the original landscape of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone peoples, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. We offer gratitude to the land, to the water, to the air that surrounds us, and pay respects to the past, present, and future of the Ohlone peoples who continue to be present in their homelands and throughout the diaspora. We recognize as members of the Stanford and also the Berkeley communities that we continue to benefit from the use and occupation of these lands. Before I begin, before Dr. Schmidt-Padilla begins, I want to just give you a brief introduction on who he is. We, wanted to start this Berkeley-Stanford workshop with something of a common denominator of somebody who we all feel very proud of as a member of our communities. So I will tell you that Dr. Schmidt-Padilla received his PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. He was also a research associate at the Center on the Politics of Development. Right now, he is a postdoctoral, visitor here at Stanford at the Poverty Violence Governance Lab, directed by Professor Beatriz Magaloni. And his research interests are quite wide. He looks into questions of the political economy of development in Latin America, as well as sub-Saharan Africa. But today he will be telling us about some very, very important issues that he is very committed to having to do with his home country from El Salvador. So he will be talking about issues related to crime, to human capital, to immigration, and policing more broadly in developing countries, but with a special focus in El Salvador. Carlos, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Professor Diaz-Calleros. Thank you, everyone, for attending this presentation. Today, I'm going to be presenting joint work with Nikita Melnikov and Maria Michaela Sfiaci, who are both at Princeton, that seeks to quantify the socioeconomic effects of gang violence with a focus on El Salvador. Before I kind of go into the details of my presentation, I want to start off with a motivation, both theoretical and substantive, of why this is important. In developed societies, such as the US, we often think about non-state actors as having a detrimental impact on economic development. Organized crime might, impede the provision of public goods, security, the enforcement of contracts, and property rights. On the opposite side of the spectrum, in areas where the state is unable to control and provide public goods, non-state actors can fulfill the essential institutional functions that are lacking in that vacuum. However, we know very little about the intermediate case, where both the state and non-state actors kind of coexist closely. In particular, in the setting we're going to focus on, we study criminal organizations, which mainly function in urban areas, where one part of the city is controlled by the state, and the other part is controlled by these criminal organizations. And the research question that's going to kind of guide us through the study is, how do non-state criminal actors affect economic development? Now, this is a kind of like a theoretical motivation, and a more substantive one close to Latin America is the fact that criminal organizations have been responsible for the recent increase in violence across the developing world. 43 of the 50 cities with the highest levels of violence are unfortunately located in the Latin American region. And this is particularly due to drug cartels, Jalisco Nueva Generación, Colombian drug cartels, as well as gangs such as Comando Vermelho in Brazil, that have complete control of certain neighborhoods and sometimes even cities. Anecdotal evidence suggests that in El Salvador, up to 50% of the population lives in territories controlled by gangs. And this setting is quite common throughout Latin America, like I mentioned. There's a really exciting work coming out of Colombia by Chris Blattman and co-authors from the University of Chicago that's looking at oficinas and combos in Colombia, and as well by Professor Magaloni and co-authors here at Stanford that's looking about gangs' role in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. So what are we doing in this study? In this study, we focus on two of the major gangs in Latin America, the quite most notorious ones and perhaps even well known to some of you, MS-13 and the Salvadoran faction of 18th Street, also known as Berkeley-Stanford. These are groups that are similar and present all over developing countries, as far as Honduras, all the way to South Africa, Jamaica, Philippines, etc. These groups are known for extorting and restricting the mobility of individuals living under their control. For the case of Central American gangs, they're also potentially responsible for the recent influx of refugees coming to the US. While many people around the world live in the control of gangs and non-state actors, such as drug cartels, Boko Haram, etc., it is very difficult to obtain causal evidence on what are the effects these groups have on development in terms of like human capital accumulation, durable goods, income, etc. However, the Salvadoran case allows us to study this question because it has a natural experiment, a rather unfortunate one. So in the early 1990s, El Salvador didn't have any powerful gangs. However, in 1996, due to a change in American immigration policy, individuals with criminal records in the US were repatriated to the country. And when in El Salvador, these individuals quickly reestablished the gangs, and they quickly gained control over parts of the country, particularly due to the fact that the country was recovering from a very brutal civil war in the 1980s. And this has allowed us to use two kind of identification strategies to constantly identify and kind of quantify what are the socioeconomic costs of gang rule. And first we do this through a spatial regression discontinuity design, which I'll go into detail, that pretty much compares households and individuals immediately inside and outside gang borders in San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador. And kind of to generalize this to the whole country, then we approach this in a difference in difference strategy that compares locations with gang presence to areas without gang presence before and after this kind of like immigration shock that happened in 1997. And sorry, the law passed in 1996, but it took the American law that changed the immigration policy passed in 1996 and took effect in 1997. To give you just a very brief preview of our results, which I'll go into detail later in my presentation, when answering the question, how do criminal organizations affect local economic development? When we focus on the case of San Salvador, we find that individuals living under gang control have significantly worse off education, wealth, and income than individuals living immediately like 50 meters away, right? So just like crossing the street, you see very drastic drops in welfare indicators. And when we generalize this to the whole country with our difference in difference analysis, we see that locations with historic gang presence, particularly of gang leaders, have lower rates of light luminosity, lower rates of light luminosity, which is a proxy for economic development when data is lacking. And kind of the novelty of our paper is kind of like looking at what explains this. What explains the detrimental effects gangs are having on development? And very crucially, we find there's no difference in public goods provision. So both areas inside and outside gang territories, are equally dissatisfied with the public goods being provided by the Salvadoran state. However, we document, and kind of like where the novelty of this comes in, is that we document a previously unexplored mechanism, and it's that gangs intentionally limit the mobility of individuals, and it has really important ramifications in terms of labor market access. Okay. For those of you unfamiliar with gangs in my home country, let me give you a very brief, generalized kind of introduction. Both MS-13 and the Salvadoran faction of 18th Street formed in the late 1970s in immigrant communities in the US, predominantly in the Los Angeles area. And then two major policy events shaped their interaction vis-a-vis El Salvador. First, you have the mass repatriations of Salvadorans to the US in the late 1990s, from Salvadorans from the US to El Salvador in the late 1990s. And when in El Salvador, you have a very weak state that was still recovering from a civil war that reacted inefficiently with very quick fixes that only strengthened gang structures. So they responded by pretty much incarcerating anyone that had a gang elusive tattoo. And while in prison, this actually allowed gangs to strengthen their coordination across the country and become very powerful criminal structures. Just to give you a little bit better sense of the importance of that kind of shift in American immigration policy, in 1996, the United States passed the Illegal Immigration Reform and Responsibility Act, which made it easier to deport individuals with criminal records. As a result, in 1997, we were able to document approximately 500 gang members that were deported back to El Salvador. And they were quickly able to reestablish the gangs. And this is the historic gang leaders, also known as the Ranfla Nacional, like the highest kind of coordinating structure of the MS-13 and 18th Street in El Salvador. And some similar events also took place in Honduras and Guatemala, but not to the scale as they did in El Salvador. Just to give you a sense of the magnitude of the repatriations, I mean, there's very little data before 1995, and this is data from the Salvadoran government. But then there's an uptick that starts in 1997, and then it picks up again with the passing of the US Patriot Act that creates ICE, and then leads to this giant increase in repatriations back to El Salvador. Of particular note, again, are those 500 individuals that were very notorious gang leaders in the US, and then were sent to El Salvador, and they were able to kind of exploit the devastation from the Civil War and the weak both communal and family networks that pretty much were destroyed during the Civil War to kind of refound again these two gangs. And this is kind of like one of my favorite quotes that kind of captures the degree of how the gang kind of expanded in the country. That comes from Briscoe and Kessberg. It's like gangs didn't steal the territory from the state; they simply occupied it when it was empty, right? So gangs came to a vacuum of power, and they were able to quickly seize control. It is likely that in the beginning, gangs were able to establish themselves in relatively poor neighborhoods where the state was not present. However, they quickly expanded their control to other areas. And when they were able to expand, the final demarcation of the boundaries was determined in part because of the ability of the police to prevent them from expanding, and also from the rival gangs finding them back. So that's kind of what kind of determines those gang demarcations that we're going to exploit to quantify the impact of gang rule on socioeconomic status. In the territories they control, gangs exert near total control. Like they're pretty much whatever they say is law. For example, to prevent police informants and members of rival gangs from entering their territory, they have implemented a system of checkpoints where either the gang members themselves or their very close collaborators, people that are wanting to join the gang, check individuals' place of residence to make sure they don't come from a rival gang territory. And most of the revenue comes from extortion, although there's also some drug trafficking. For households and businesses inside gang territory, they have to pay a periodic renta, which amounts to like rent, to the gangs that ranges anywhere from a couple of dollars up to $100 in a week. Okay, and this is very detrimental for income and individuals' welfare. And for individuals outside of gang territory that want to go work inside gang territory, and also for distribution firms and transportation companies, in order to enter, they also have to pay a fee. And if not, they face a beating or sometimes even like murderous violence. And this quote from an individual that was interviewed by Crisis Group, which is an NGO that does a lot of work in El Salvador, kind of encapsulates the importance of those boundaries. And it reads, "Do you see that place across the road? I could never get in there since it's 18th Street territory. And this individual, Jaime, which is not his real name, comes from MS-13 territory, but he's not a gang member. If they see me in there, they think I might be a spy, right? Gangs are really worried about 18th Street coming into MS-13 territory or vice versa. For sure, he'll get beaten, and he could easily get killed, right? So these boundaries pretty much determine life and death for a lot of individuals. And we're going to leverage those boundaries to estimate the impact of gang growth. So how are we going to do this? The first approach, we're going to follow a regression discontinuity approach. And for that, we're going to utilize gang presence data that comes from a local newspaper, El Diario de Hoy, which verified the veracity of police maps through its own historical accounts of extortion. So like where the newspaper distributors were getting extorted in order to kind of create these maps. And they published it in the daily. And then we're going to leverage administrative data that comes from the 1992 census to see how the conditions were of these boundaries prior to the arrival of gangs, and the 2007 census, which is 10 years after gangs were established in the country. And the unit of analysis is going to be the census tract, and this is a relatively small geographic unit of around 250 to 300 households. So it's really small and very granular, so we're able to get really detailed measurements. Likewise, we complement this with our own fieldwork data that we collected in 2019, where we sampled 23,000 households at the border of gang territory. And this allows us to address questions about migration and also document the mechanisms that might drive the results I'll show you next. So the gang controlled neighborhoods in San Salvador are denoted in this map. So here we recreated the map that was produced by El Diario de Hoy. The gray lines denote like the census tract. Again, it's around 250 to 300 households per census tract. The dark blue areas are areas controlled by MS-13, and the light blue areas are the areas controlled by 18th Street. And crossing from light blue territory to dark blue territory is almost could be lethal for any individual, because the opposite gangs might think you're a spy. And they might, resort to violence to kick you out or get information out of you. Okay. And sorry, what we're doing in this regression continuity, so we're comparing the neighborhoods immediately inside gang territory, so immediately inside a shaded area, to those immediately outside a gang territory. And this is not necessarily what we do, but this is just like an illustrative example. So just consider the households on the left of this picture are those immediately inside gang territory. And the households on the right are those immediately, the households on the left immediately outside gang territory, and the households on the right immediately inside gang territory. So we're literally computing households 50 meters or less away from one another. And we're seeing how, gang rule impacts development indicators. Okay. So first, one of the outcomes we look at is the probability of having concrete walls. And this is just an indicator of your house having better materials, and be more sturdy. And this is the 1992 results. And you see crucially that at the border, there's no difference. At the border, the households have the similar probabilities of having their walls made of concrete. However, when you look at 2007, you see that the areas inside gang territory have a 4% lower probability of having concrete walls, right? So, and this is highly statistically significant. So that tells us, this individual's the quality of their homes is not as sturdy as the ones outside of gang territory. Okay, that's a material thing. Then we also look at durable goods. So the probability of owning a TV. Again, this is the 1992 result. Sorry, the red area outside of gang territory. The yellow-orange area is inside gang territory. And again, no discontinuity at the border. This is 1992. However, when we look at this in 2007, we see that the area immediately inside gang territory has a 2% lower probability of owning a TV. Okay, so that's durable goods. You might think that those are material things and that don't necessarily matter that much. So then we turn to human capital. Again, in 1992, there is no discontinuity right at the border. So the areas immediately inside and outside have similar levels of education. However, when we turn to the 2007 results, we see that areas inside gang territory have, on average, 2 years less of education, right? So those individuals inside gang territory have around two years less of education, and obviously, that affects the jobs they can qualify for, among other things. And obviously, in the paper, we look at a myriad of outcomes, development outcomes, and then we kind of create indices that kind of characterize the dwelling characteristics, household characteristics, and individual characteristics. And again, you see those very drastic jumps. So overall, we're seeing that in terms of material conditions, the ownership of durable goods, and human capital conditions, the red areas, which are immediately outside of gang territory, are relatively better off, significantly, I would say, better off. And this is highly statistically significant to a number of tests. And to kind of quantify this in terms of income, we see that areas immediately inside gang territory, as soon as you cross the border into gang territory, the income on average drops by around $350, right? So to put it another way, just stepping across gang territory into outside of gang territory, you're almost doubling your income, right? So these are very, very strong, spatial differences in terms of development outcomes. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about this before I continue? Any clarifying questions?
Could you speak briefly about the you talked a lot about like the threat of death if you sort of cross from one gang's territory to another. What are the sort of consequences people face from crossing between non-gang territory into gang territory and vice versa?
I think that's an excellent question. So when you're going from the shaded blue areas to the non-shaded areas, so you're going outside of gang territory, if you're coming from non-gang territory to gang territory, you usually have to pay some sort of fee to operate, like to do business in that area. And actually, in another paper, we look at distribution firms and the extortion they have to pay to operate in gang territory. If you don't pay that extortion fee to be able to do business, you face violence, right? If you're going from gang territory to non-gang territory, you usually don't have to pay anything. But when you come back, you might face, again, that extortion to kind of live in that territory.
Can you move? Can you leave gang territory and move to the gray areas?
Yes, you can definitely move, and actually part of what I'm going to talk about that next. But it's relatively, because you have so much less income, and I don't have the slide in this presentation, but the rent is $200 higher in non-gang territory. So that obviously affects where you can live. But I'll talk about completely like just leaving the country next in the underlying assumptions behind this model.
If I can just interject here for a second, those of you who are in the Zoom, please do tell us who you are, because there are people who are on the YouTube channel who might not be able to know what's going on.
Sorry. Robert Nelson, I'm a PhD student, second year at Stanford.
Thank you. Okay, go ahead, Carlos, sorry.
Before I go into like the mechanisms, so like one might be explaining this very drastic socioeconomic differences, I just want to talk a little bit about like the underlying assumptions behind this econometric model. In order for the regression discontinuity to provide an unbiased estimate of the effects of gang presence on development outcomes, two main assumptions have to hold. First is that prior to the arrival of gangs, so prior to 1997, the locations either side of the boundary have to have similar levels of development. And I showed you that. For example, if you think back about education, in 1992, again, there's no the discontinuity at the border in terms of education, but after gangs arrived, there is. So we validated that assumption. And then crucially, we also have to think about that there also has to be no selective migration. And what does that mean? That means that we need to have in-sample migration. And that just means individuals from the treatment gang control territory moving to the control areas when they see a gangs arriving. And also out-of-sample migration, so people just moving completely out of San Salvador or even El Salvador when they see gangs arriving. And we address this in a number of ways. And I'm just gonna briefly talk upon that because I wanna get to the mechanisms. In order of addressing in-sample migration, compared to, for example, like the US, where people move relatively often, in El Salvador, that's relatively rare. Most of my family there has lived in the same home that they own most of their lives. So when we just focus, when we ask individuals how long they live in the same place, 80% of them say they always lived in one location. They had never moved, okay? And usually when they move, it's a very life-changing moment, like, they get married or even they have kids and they're moving out of their parents' house. But most kids live with their parents up to like 30, 35 years old until they get married. So the moving outside of gang territory from one side to the other is relatively rare compared to the US. But when we control for that and we just subset to those individuals that have always lived there, for example, in this result for income, we see the results are relatively the same. So this is the previous result I showed you on income. And this is for the one, if you just subset to those individuals who have always lived in the same place, okay? To address out-of-sample migration, so think about this as like people completely leaving the gang control territory or the area immediately outside of gang control territory. We provide 3 solutions, and I'm just going to briefly mention them right now. First is we show that there's no discontinuities in population density, so both areas are equally dense in terms of population. We also run a lot of simulations, and we show that sample migration needs to be quite high. So 60% of individuals need to leave to generate discontinuities prior to the arrival of the gangs. And given the fact that individuals don't move as much, such high rates of selective migration are highly unlikely in this case. And we also proxy for the propensity of out-of-sample migration through whether a family member lives abroad. And again, we find no evidence of selective out-of-sample migration that might affect the results we're claiming. Likewise,
Carlos, can I ask a question? This is Alberto Diaz Calleros asking a question. You seem to suggest that housing characteristics or dwelling characteristics, the magnitudes are not so big, at least the TV one you showed. But then the income and the education are huge, no? So I was just wondering whether people, I mean, in a way, people are not moving because the housing is better in one side than another, or things like that, or am I reading this wrong?
So the percentages of households already owning a TV set, for example, is already relatively high. It's around like 94% in the control group. So it's just going from like almost everyone owning a TV versus slightly less amount owning a TV, but it's still statistically significant. For the having concrete walls, I think that's also similar. Like it's an urban area, so everything is relatively well off compared to the rest of the country. But the rent does change. And sorry, I didn't include those results in this presentation. Rents immediately outside of gang territory are around $200 higher than those inside of gang territories. So, given the drop in income, it's relatively difficult for individuals to access housing outside of gang territory. And again, because it's a urban area, it's possible that almost everyone has a TV set and concrete walls compared to rural areas, which we'll look at in the difference analysis. I don't know if that answered your question.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So we also perform a number of robustness checks. We do what is called donut hole analysis, where we exclude observations near the boundary of gang territory. So right now we're looking at households 400 meters from the border and both inside and outside. So we change that from 50 upwards of 600 meters, and we see the results still hold. We estimate the effect separately for MS 13 and 18th Street, and the results still hold. The only key difference is that actually MS-13 territories are slightly worse off, and that might be because MS-13 is a little bit more violent than 18th Street. We also excluded the 10% of the richest households and individuals, the 10% of the poorest households and individuals. We also estimate the effects of the island territories. So again, there are very large chunks of gang territory, but there's also relatively small chunks of gang territory. So we estimate those effects as well, and the results are robust to all of this. And here is just like the donut hole analysis, where again, we're just removing the observations super close to the boundary, and those discontinuities are still there. So next, we at least like in education, for example, having 2 years loss of education and like $350 less in terms of income, those are very drastic results. And we want to understand like what explains this. So to analyze this, we actually conducted our own survey. And these are some pictures from our peer work where we went to communities both inside and outside of gang territory. And we sampled around 23,000 households. And this allowed us to measure questions on mobility patterns, labor market decisions, and also public good provisions, and also its quality. Why limits on labor mobility and labor mobility in general might be important has to do with like anecdotal evidence that suggests, again, like there's the system of checkpoints where gangs check the IDs of individuals entering or leaving the neighborhood. So in your national ID, called DUI, in El Salvador, when you go into these checkpoints, the gangs might check where it says you live, like what neighborhood you live in, and if you live in a neighborhood from an opposite gang, from a rival gang, they might think you're a spy, and they might question you, sometimes beat you, and in some cases, it may even lead to death, right? And mostly, the gangs restrict mobility to minimize the possibility that informants, either from the police or rival gangs, enter the territory. But the borders also help facilitate extortion. This is from a report of Insight Crime. This is like this news organization dedicated to reporting on crime in Latin America in general. It's like one of the greatest advantages of having borders between rival gangs is imposing taxes. Everyone pays: companies that install cable television, the women that sell in central markets, taxi drivers, etc. And also this quote by the Salvadoran foreign minister that she mentioned a couple of years ago. Those individuals request the poorest and most vulnerable populations to pay just to cross the street. Again, just to enter the territory. So again, these restrictions are meant for gangs, for gangs to protect themselves, and also to facilitate their illicit economies, mainly extortion. But again, they may also have a detrimental effect on the populations that live there and are not part of the gang. So here we look at kind of like measurements on labor mobility. So this is the proportion of individuals that work in the same neighborhood as they live. And again, more individuals are working in the same neighborhood that they live in gang control territory, the yellow areas. Also, more individuals are likely to work in gang control locations if they live if they live inside gang territory. And this is kind of like what was most striking for us, is that less individuals think there's less freedom of movement inside gang territory, right? And this actually led to a law change in 2006 in El Salvador, where limits to the restriction of movement was made a crime, punishable for up to 6 years. Actually, and there's been a lot of recent prosecutions by the district attorney in El Salvador that's trying to address this. And this is just some quotes from the qualitative evidence that kind of just give you a better sense of what's happening. You can't work anywhere without the permission from the local gang. This individual that was interviewed, he says, he's thought about getting several IDs that say he was born in different parts of the country in order to avoid problems when he's crossing the gang boundaries. And this other individual says that the gang demarcation is more important than the official kind of like government or territorial demarcation in the country. Obviously, the consequences of like the low labor mobility has consequences in the economy and also just individual welfare. And one of those, and that just manifests itself in like higher rates of informality. Informality is like non-regulated work, and there's more informal labor in gang-controlled territories. And again, I can't stress this enough. This is literally, you're just crossing the street, and you're seeing in just like the proportion of individuals involved in informal work increases automatically. We also rule out other mechanisms that are very common in the literature, right? Or the things that we expected may actually be driving this difference in welfare, 50 meters, communities 50 meters apart. We look at similar rates of public goods provision in both areas. There's also similar, it's not satisfaction, actually it's more like dissatisfaction with public goods from the government. Similar differences in urbanization and road density. There's also no discontinuities in the level of violence, particularly gang-related homicides and robberies. Again, because this is at the border, so the gang members are coming outside of the border to, murder or rob cars outside of their territory, and then bring them back into gang territory. Also, no difference in the probability of being extorted. Gangs also extort businesses outside of the territory they control. However, in the territory they control, they usually extort. The amount of extortion is higher, and also the ability of gangs to enforce the extortion and not face prosecution from the state or the police is also lower, because the police is usually not present there. There's also no discontinuity in hours worked, so that just means like both individuals in either side of the boundary are exerting the same level of kind of effort. So that's not explaining, that's not driving the income results. If we just focus on employed individuals, we also see very similar results. So we think our results are pretty robust, and one of the main driving, not necessarily the sole driver, but again, one of the main drivers is again this limit on labor mobility. Okay, and then after, so this has all been just focusing on San Salvador, but we try to generalize this to the whole country. So here what we do is we do a difference in difference approach, where we document the first ever report gang-related homicide. So sorry, we divide the country into a grid, and we find, in many ways, with like really old documents, the first reported gang homicide in each grid, and we geocode them. And then we compare the growth in light luminosity in grids without a gang homicide, so the areas without a point, versus the areas with a point that had a gang homicide, as far back as we could. Right, this is from like the late 1990s, early 2000s. Okay, and then we see different luminosity growth in areas exposed to gang, being inside gang territory versus non-gang territory. So the blue areas is not gang territory, and the red dash areas are gang territory. Okay, and if we see this in kind of coefficient form, how is this different from zero? We see like the areas immediately with gang presence have lower rates of growth and luminosity, right? Not necessarily luminosity itself, but growth and luminosity. Okay, and then just very quickly to conclude, because I want to open up the space for questions. Overall, we kind of quantified how the exposure to organized crime affects level of urban development. Again, particularly in developing countries in Latin America, where this is becoming an ever-increasing problem. We use new survey data to demonstrate that the results can be driven by restrictions on mobility, and the gangs implement the system of checkpoints for the population living in this territory. And obviously, this coincides very nicely with like the evidence in the economic literature that argues that free trade and the free movement of people and goods is better than being more self-sufficient and not necessarily having the ability of movement. In previous literature, again, like I mentioned in one of my first slides, has focused on non-state actors in very isolated rural communities where there's no incentives to restrict individuals' mobility to keep territorial control, because the state is probably not going to come there. But in this case, the gangs are forced to implement a system of checkpoints because they fear both the state, so the police coming, or the rival gang, either MS-13 for 18th Street or 18th Street for MS-13. In terms of policy implications, again, this is a growing problem, not just in Latin America, but all parts of the developing world. There are grants in South Africa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Philippines, etc. And we usually tend to focus just on their violence, right? Or the drug trafficking, not on the social cost of these criminal organizations. In this paper, one of the things we do is we highlight a potential huge cost when the state completely cedes its territories to criminal organizations. And a lack of labor mobility in Central America might also be, indirectly or directly responsible for the recent influx of refugees coming to the US or other parts of the world. Yeah, and with that, I conclude. Thank you so much.